Hello, and welcome to HHH, podcast where we talk about the horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and welcome to today's episode. If you're liking what you're hearing here on HHH, make sure you're sharing it with your friends, family, anybody who likes spooky kind of things, or even the people who don't, freak them out a little bit. It's good to have that. Make sure you're subscribing so you get notified every time we have a new episode come out. But today I'm excited because the person we're talking about today is someone that a lot of people actually don't know about. And it's kind of shocking that people don't know about him. So we've talked about Idi Amin and how terrible of a dictator he was. He was awful and he killed a lot of people. But today, the person we're talking about is even worse than Idi Amin. I know that's hard to believe, but he is so much worse. This individual actually killed over 2 million of his own people, and he did it because he was working to create a perfect society, his ideal perfect society. And if you didn't fit in the vision of that perfect society, you were a goner. So you probably have never heard of him. I don't know. Some people might have, but a lot of people have never heard about him. And it makes me sad because people should hear about this. People should know about this because this genocide actually took place after the Holocaust. And I wonder if that's part of why people don't know about it. But today we are going to be talking about the infamous Pol Pot. So hang on, this is a bumpy ride. There's a lot of political jargon. We're going to try and skip over that because it's kind of boring. But we're going to dive deep into his life and tell you why exactly he is such a horrible human in history. Pol Pot, not actually his real name. I don't know what it is with all of these horrible humans and loving to change their name, but his name was not originally Pol Pot. His real name was Salazar, meaning white or pale. And just so you guys know, you know how good I am at pronouncing names. So there's a lot of strange names in this story, so forgive me if I say it wrong, but I did get Salazar correct. And it means white or pale. And he was actually born May 19th in 1925 in a very small town called Perek Sabuv, located about 100 miles north of the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh. So his father, Loth, who later took on the name Salath Pem, telling you, they like changing their names, it's weird, was a pretty wealthy, well-off man, and his mother, Soknem, was a locally respected pious Buddhist. She was very religious and wanted all of her children to be raised in the Buddhist religion. So Pol Pot was actually number 8 of 9 siblings. There were 2 girls and 7 boys, and 3 of his siblings actually died when they were young. So he was born, like I said, into a pretty wealthy family who owned over 50 acres of rice paddies that was roughly about 10 times more than the national average. So they actually would work their own rice paddies and everything, but because they had so much land, they were wealthier than the majority of the people in Cambodia at the time. So he was a well-off child, and at the age of 5 or 6, around that age, he was sent to live with an older brother in Phnom Penh to receive an education at a monastery and eventually at a French Catholic school. Now, his older brother that he was sent to go live with was actually the emissary for the king of Cambodia. So this really elevated their family status and gave Pol Pot a lot of higher social standing and a lot of connections that actually become very important later in his life. But he was considered wealthy and upper class, which is ironic, so ironic, and you'll see why later. But Cambodia at the time that Pol Pot was young was actually under French occupation. And like I said, there is a lot of political background to this story. And trust me, in my research, it got very boring. So I'm going to sum it up so you have the gist of what you need to know so you can follow along with what's happening in the story. So Cambodia was under French occupation. And they had occupied Cambodia from 1863 to 1941, a total of 90 years. That is a long time. But when Japan jumped into World War II, they actually ousted the French from Cambodia. And since, Germany kicked France's butt at the beginning of the war, France didn't have the manpower to hold Cambodia, so they just kind of gave it up to the Japanese because they needed to go home and defend their own land. So this actually caused Cambodia to declare their own independence and start living like a free nation. And the people started loving the fact that they were no longer under French occupation. But this did not last very long because once World War II ended, France tried to reinstate the control that they had over Cambodia. And obviously, that did not go over well. And this actually, the French occupation had a big impact on Pol Pot's life, like politically, and may or may not have led him down the path that he took. So that is a good enough background for now, so you know kind of the political and, I guess, social standing of what was happening in Cambodia at the time. Now, Pol Pot was not a good student, so he went to the capital to become educated in the ways of the French, and he was not a good student. He actually was held back 2 years. When he eventually received his certificate this is in French, so this is going to be rough. D'études primaires complémentaires in 1941, and he was 16 when he received that certificate. In 1942, he was selected to attend the Collège Promotionnel, where he told you these names are rough, guys, where he actually played soccer and baseball, and him and his friends actually went on a tour to raise money to go to Angkor Wat. If you don't know what Angkor Wat is, look up a picture. It is gorgeous, and one day I will go there because it is beautiful. So him and his friends went on this tour to Angkor Wat, and on this trip, it actually awakened a sense of pride in his country to Pol Pot. Like, he really became interested in politics and really wanted to turn his country back to the glory that it used to be and overthrow the French because he was sick of the occupation. So this trip to Angkor Wat actually started him down his dark road of tyranny. And it's just such a simple thing. He just went and saw this beautiful temple, and it triggered something deep and dark inside of him. He was only 20 years old at the time of this trip, but it made a lasting impression on him. In 1947, he left school and actually took some entrance exams for Lycée Sissoith, which was a school in France, and he was accepted miraculously. So he actually went to France to start school, and he earned a scholarship to this elite engineering school in Paris, where he studied radio technology and was introduced to all these communist ideas. And I have to back up because in between this French engineering school and the Lycée Sissoith school, he actually ended up failing out of his exams and had to go to carpentry school. And this probably shocked his parents because carpentry was a lower class level than farming. And his family, like I said, was very wealthy and very well off and had a very high standing. So it was kind of upsetting for him to go to carpentry school. But he later ended up, because of social connections and things, getting that scholarship to go to the elite engineering school in Paris. So while he was there studying, he got deeply into studying communists and into the communist circles, and it was very attractive at the time. First, when he went to school, he was very indulgent in all the French experience. He partied until he found some like-minded friends, and that's when he started really looking into communism. And they noticed that around the world, there was a lot of armed resistance against, occupation of people's countries, like in China or Japan or things like that. The resistance that was violent seemed to work the best in their eyes. So they really started noticing that it worked well to overthrow a government when you started resisting with arms and violence. So while they're in France, him and his friends form a group called Sursi Marxiste. With these like-minded friends, they all would get together and read Marxist literature. So all of the writings from Karl Marx, and they would have these sessions they were self-criticism sessions, that basically what they would do is they would all come together and talk about how horrible they were and like how loathsome of people they were and how they needed to improve. And they just basically just humble bragged for hours kind of thing. Like it's strange. I don't understand it. But at this time, communism was actually very popular for younger people because it was on one of France's largest parties. The communists had just taken over China and Russia, and it was very appealing to Pol Pot because of the ideas that it pushed. Like, everyone needed to be equal. Everyone needed to be on the same playing level or on the same level. And he really loved that idea and really wanted that for his country. So remember, Pol Pot, he did not do well in school. He was not a good student. And he actually admitted later that the text of Karl Marx was actually too dense for him to understand. He didn't fully read them or understand them. So he was just going off of other ideas that people were talking about that were supposedly communist. And he actually loved Stalin and did read a lot of Stalin's work, and he loved the idea of rapid industrialization and totalitarian governments. He loved those ideas, which later you will see how those get reflected in the way he treats his citizens. And ironically, rapid industrialization is, you'll see later, basically opposite of what he did. So anyways, spoiler alert, he really didn't fully understand what he was talking about in these things. But he really was passionate about especially Stalin and the teachings of Marx that he could understand. Now, in 1953, he actually failed out of school, so he would leave Paris. And he felt like his country really needed him at that time because they were trying to rid themselves of that French rule. They were sick of having the French in there. And it is believed that he actually didn't leave because he was passionate about freeing his country, but it was because he failed all of his exams and flunked out of school and lost his scholarship. So he had no way to pay for being in France anymore. But he kind of touted it as, oh no, my country needs me. I must return. They need me. So a lot of his reasoning is a little foggy, and his timeline's a little foggy too. But he goes back to France. Now, the French did allow the people to vote on the leaders that they wanted to lead them. So this actually gave rise to the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party won, and the Communist Party was also a big player in the elections. It started to really grow at this time. And the day that Pol Pot actually arrived back in Cambodia, January 13th, 1953, the king that had been elected by the people actually disbanded the government and imprisoned all of the democratic leaders of the parliament and started ruling by decree. So the day that Pol Pot got back, the king basically overthrew the government and was like, you know what? No more. This is now mine. We are done. I'm going to control the country the way I want to. And soon, obviously, people were not all happy about this, so civil war soon broke out across all of Cambodia. And during this war, there was a ton of atrocities that took place on both sides of the war that we're not going to get into because Pol Pot wasn't really involved in a lot of that. What he actually did is he had a lot of high-ranking friends, and using his wealth of family and connections, again, super ironic that he's using his wealth and connections. You'll see why later. But he started growing in influence, and his 12 friends of the Cercle Marxiste would join together in northern Cambodia, where the Viet Minh Eastern Zone was, and they actually connected with Vietnam guerrillas. So at this time, Vietnam was actually trying to force France out too, and so the Viet Cong was starting to get really big in Vietnam. So Pol Pot connected in northern Cambodia with Vietnamese guerrillas that were hiding in Cambodia at the time. So him and his friends joined this group of guerrilla fighters, and they assigned them tasks, and Pol Pot was given menial tasks, like he worked on the vegetable garden, he served food in the cantina, he would slowly learn Vietnamese, which would help him have an advantage to give him a chance to move up in the rankings. And he eventually became a secretary to Tao Smouth. I don't know if that is how you say his name. He's the secretary of the Khmer Viet Minh's Eastern Zone. So he had more connections to know what was happening and who was important and all of those kinds of things. So he's slowly trying to build those good connections. And after the French finally left Vietnam, the Vietnamese guerrillas, the Viet Cong, drove them out. After this happened, the Viet Cong had to get out of Cambodia. That was part of the deal in the Geneva Conference. This was at the end of the First Indochine War. That's what it was called. So once that conference was held, they agreed that they would leave Cambodia and go back to Vietnam. And when these Vietnamese guerrillas left, Pol Pot decided to stay and form his political group in Cambodia to start trying to overthrow his own government. So when him and his friends from the Cercle Marxiste came back after joining these guerrillas, they started a political party so that they could compete in the 1955 elections, because they were still having those, even though the king kind of overthrew the French. So while he was waiting and biding his time for his party to grow and to spread and to gain more followers, he actually was a school teacher. He taught history. So watch out for those school teachers. I know you're listening. Who knows? You guys could do something sketchy. I'm just kidding. So while he was teaching school at night, he would go around gathering more and more people to join his Communist Party. on July 14th, 1956, that was actually Bastille Day. If we'll talk about the Bastille at some point, but that's a French holiday. Pol Pot actually married his first wife, Kyo Paneri. She was a fellow communist who believed that violent revolution was necessary to get the change that they were wanting in Cambodia. But she eventually would play a pretty big role in the running of Pol Pot's evil government and all the atrocities that they would commit. At some point, she even came down with schizophrenia, and Pol Pot would eventually divorce her after all of this. But getting ahead of myself. So, moving on. So, the Communist Party was banned by the king at some point. He decided that it was too big of a threat. It was growing too much. So, he banned it and called it the Khmer Rouge. So, anyone who is a part of the Khmer Rouge party was banned. And after the king banned this political party, the violence from the Khmer Rouge actually increased. And the more the king tried to silence them, the stronger they became and the more violent they became. So one of Pol Pot's friends was actually taken by the king's men and killed because of his involvement with the Khmer Rouge. And this obviously triggered something in Pol Pot and inspired him to get even more involved and join their cause, because his friend, he didn't feel deserved to die. Now, this is an interesting part. The United States also plays a part in this story because at that time, so the Viet Cong had driven the French out. Well, the United States did not want communists over in that area. So obviously, here comes the Vietnam War. So the United States was trying to weed out the Viet Cong that was hiding in Cambodia. So because the Vietnam War was taking place, a lot of the Viet Cong would flee into Cambodia and hide in the jungles. So to try and drive them out, the United States would bomb Cambodia, these Cambodian jungles, which actually killed over 150,000 Cambodians, which is devastating. But because of this action, it drove so many people to join the Viet Cong and the Khmer Rouge because they saw the atrocities that the United States was committing against these people. And so they were obviously like, well, these apparently are the good guys over here, because why would they kill so many innocent people? So because of the actions of the United States, the numbers grew for the Khmer Rouge. Now, Pol Pot was now the official leader of the Khmer Rouge, with all of his influence and all of the, not necessarily plotting, but all of his involvement with the party led him to become the party leader. And this is actually when he started going by the name of Pol Pot. Before that, he went by his given name, but now that he was becoming a leader, obviously, like all of these crazy people, had to change his name to sound more fierce and more recognizable, I guess. I don't know. So he was aware that the bulk of the army that he was gathering was actually coming from peasants. But he knew that he needed to have them 100% loyal to the party. So he actually came up with some tactics to try and force them to be loyal to him. So first, when these new recruits would come to the camps that they were training at, he would lock them in a cell until they would prove they were ready to be obedient. I don't know what he had in mind by proving themselves. I don't know what that looked like to him, but apparently they got locked in a cell until he was able to actually prove that they were going to be obedient to him. And they had a rigorous disciplinary structure that they would often gather together and, strangely, talk about all of their weaknesses, just like he did in college. So he really convinced these people to be loyal to him and be loyal to the party. So between the torturing of keeping them in a cell and talking together often about their weaknesses, they all became very tight-knit and very loyal to the party and to the cause. In 1970, the king, at that time he actually called himself a prime minister to make it sound more democratic, actually was overthrown. But because he was overthrown, he actually sought out an alliance with his former enemies, the Khmer Rouge. So the people that he had condemned and, put to death because of because they were part of the Khmer Rouge, he decided, oh, you know what? They could be good allies. Let's join forces. Let's get together, because he wanted to obviously get his power back. By 1964, the Khmer Rouge had actually grown so significantly that their army was big enough that China actually decided to provide them with weapons, and they controlled the northern 2/3 of Cambodia. And that's just in 1964. So in 1970, when the king gets overthrown, obviously, the Khmer Rouge is not necessarily going to support them because they are large enough and big enough that they don't need the king anymore. So in December of 1974, Pol Pot felt powerful enough that he could actually go and take the capital himself. So he gathered all of his forces, his massive forces that had been growing and growing over the years, and went to invade the capital of Cambodia. And it only took him 5 days. That's all it took. He overwhelmed the capital and took it in 5 days. On April 17th, 1975, so a few months later, that's the day that Pol Pot actually took power and began his horrific rule. This is when things start getting crazy. So all the stuff that I've talked about leading up to this point is just kind of the political back and forth and how he kind of rose to power. And now this is the part where things get crazy, because now Pol Pot has taken control of the government. He changed the name of the whole country to Cambodia and started enacting Stalin's terrible example of how to run a country. So at first, when Pol Pot took power, the people are actually really excited, and they were ready for a change. They were ready to throw off their oppressors and ready to, be an independent country and run the country the way they wanted it to be run. Well, Pol Pot wanted to run the country the way he wanted it to be run. He had a perfect vision of how he saw his country and what it looked like. And what that meant was to build it from scratch. He wanted to start over. So first, Pol Pot ordered his men to shoot and kill any other person who had been a part of the other military, so the original military of Cambodia. He ordered if you found anyone like that, you had to shoot them on sight. And then this part blows my mind. He forced the evacuation of the capital city, claiming that the United States was actually going to come in and bomb it and kill everybody. So everybody needed to flee the city. Everyone needed to evacuate. Well, that wasn't the case. They forced people out of all of their homes. They even forced sick people out of the hospital to evacuate the entire city with these claims. But it wasn't true. The United States wasn't coming at all. The United States was too focused in Vietnam at this point. They were not going to bother with Cambodia. So many people actually died in this evacuation because of the chaos of the evacuation. It wasn't an organized evacuation. It wasn't like, okay, each house one at a time, let's evacuate. It was just mad chaos. And so people actually lost their lives in the chaos of this evacuation because it was so unorganized and people were so panicked. And like I said, it turns out the Americans weren't even going to come. He solely did this evacuation because he wanted to build the country anew from the ground up, and that included in the city. So he instructed his men to use quote unquote cutting edge violence to build this new society of his. I don't know what cutting edge, you can't see me doing air quotes, I'm doing air quotes right now. Cutting edge violence is. In my mind, violence is violence. I don't know what cutting edge violence is, but he encouraged his men to use that on his own people to start his vision of where the country should go. So this is how he began his reign of terror, with violence and encouraging violence on his own people. So 2 million people were forced out of the city, and on their way out of the city, they had to actually stop at a Khmer Rouge checkpoint. And at this checkpoint, they would be reassigned to a quote-unquote re-education camp where they would be forced into laboring in farming fields. So let me tell you Pol Pot's vision of what he believed the country should look like. He believed that, like I said, everyone should be equal, but he didn't believe everyone should be wealthy and well off and have modern conveniences. No. No, that is not what he wanted. He wanted everyone to be peasant farmers because that is what their origin was. That is what their country originally was all peasant farmers. So he wanted everyone to be a peasant farmer. So that is why they were sent off to these re-education camps and forced into farming fields and forced to labor, because that is what he envisioned all of his people would be doing. So then everyone would be well fed, right? So equality was strictly enforced. So all possessions were confiscated. Anything that you owned was now his. He took all of it. And anything that made you appear more wealthy than anyone else was immediately confiscated. And ironically, this is why I kept saying ironically he was wealthy when he was growing up. He targeted wealthy people specifically. In fact, he would target like professors and doctors. This is the part that blows my mind, is he would target doctors because they were wealthy and put them to death because they were wealthy. They ended up running out of doctors to treat people because Pol Pot had them all put to death because of their status in society, because they were above everyone else. He strictly enforced equality amongst everyone, and that meant everyone had to be poor. So once the city was empty, Pol Pot actually had his men go through the city, destroying anything that was modern. Any modern nicety or appliance or anything got destroyed. And if they found people hiding in the city, those people were dragged into the street and shot dead. They weren't even given a trial. They just dragged out into the street and shot dead. So they're destroying every modern convenience. They're killing anyone who dared stay in the city. And it just gets worse from here. In Pol Pot's mind, communism was everyone needs to be peasants. Everyone needs to be equal, and that means peasant farmers. So the Khmer Rouge considered anyone who lived in the city before they evacuated it, the more wealthy, to be capitalists, and they hated them. Again, so ironic, because Pol Pot himself came from a wealthy, privileged background, but they targeted those people specifically. Anyone who was wealthy. They also targeted Buddhists, which was, again, ironic because his mother was a very devout Buddhist who really enforced those beliefs on her children. And the other things that he targeted, it's just so crazy. Like, anyone who was educated, anyone who had any social status, I've already mentioned this, like ethnic minorities, all of these people he specifically targeted. Now, he would send all these people to, those re-education camps. These people were only given half food that was given to everyone else. So anyone he considered wealthy or well off or had been a city dweller and he considered a capitalist got half the food that were given to everyone else. So everyone else still got a meager, very small portion of food, but these people got half of that. And these rules, these punishments, everything that I'm talking about was applied equally to children. It didn't matter how little they were. And if you resisted, if you pushed back at all, and you had small children, they would actually take your child and kill your child. So then you could no longer resist. Like if they were young enough, they would grab the child by the feet and basically smash them against the wall to kill them in front of you. It's horrendous. He outlawed any kind of entertainment, any form of entertainment, music, movies, whatever. And that included sports, and actually had all the sports fields, turned all the soccer fields into rice fields. So no more entertainment. Private thoughts and feelings were considered to be evil. And the state told you who you would marry. If they believed that you had fallen in love with someone outside of their dictation of who you should be marrying and what you should be doing with your life, if they believed that you had fallen in love with someone else, they would take you into the street and beat you to death. Because you could not go against the state. They knew what was best for you. And they would assign who you would be loving for the rest of your life. So they loved control. They loved to control everyone. And that included all the peasants. Everyone considered a peasant had a rice quota that they had to make. And when I say all the peasants had to meet this, I mean everybody. Everyone was a peasant at this point. And they had to get 3 tons of unhusked rice per keter. I don't know what that is. Hector? I said keter. Guys, I'm dyslexic. I read that backwards. It's a hectare. And obviously this didn't happen because it was a ridiculous requirement for people. Less than a third of that was actually being produced. And he had his whole country working rice fields. And only a third of what he was demanding was produced. In fact, they were so short on food that people were starting to get really sick and actually starve. And malnutrition was rampant because there was not enough food to go around. Although he was having every single person farm, there still was not enough food to go around because most of these people that were farming had no idea what they were doing because they had come from the city. They weren't farmers. They didn't know how to produce food. So they weren't producing. And hundreds of people were dying every single day because of the lack of food. That's how bad it was. And Pol Pot believed that this failure of the production was actually due to infiltration and traitors. He didn't think it was because of decisions he had made about forcing people who had no idea what they were doing into farming. He thought there was traitors amongst them that were trying to destroy his grand plan. So he started setting up interrogation prisons to weed out all of those people. So he actually created a purge to find anyone that he believed was a traitor and was, causing the downfall of his ultimate plan. And those people who were interrogated would be taken to the prison and tortured until they admitted that they were a traitor or until they actually would end up being killed. And he would also force their families, children included, to be brought to these prisons and tortured as well, up till death. Like if a child was too young to be interrogated, instead of interrogating them, they would just take them from the parents and kill them immediately. They didn't even waste their time. They just immediately would kill the child. And then any adult who survived torturing would be brought to the killing fields. Now, the killing fields we'll talk a little bit more about, but these, they're so bad, guys. Anyways, they would bring these people out to the killing fields and beat them to death. Now, these killing fields basically is where they would bring anyone. It didn't even have to come from these camps. It could be anybody. They would bring them to these fields and beat them to death because they didn't want to waste bullets. So they would use things like shovels or pitchforks or whatever they had on hand to beat these people to death and kill them slowly. Just because they wanted to save on bullets. Bullets were expensive. They didn't want to waste it shooting people. So they would kill these people and then bury them in these fields. Of the 14,000 prisoners that went through the gates of the interrogation prison, only 7 survived. 14,000 people, only 7 of them survived. Many of them killed were actually loyal to the Khmer Rouge. They weren't traitors. They weren't what Pol Pot thought they were, but they had been falsely accused of treason and brought to the prison anyways, and tortured and killed. At this point, the Vietnamese people had actually been successful at driving the United States out of Vietnam. So now they had turned their attention to Cambodia because relations between Vietnam and Cambodia had soured significantly. So while Pol Pot is torturing and killing thousands and thousands and thousands of people, while thousands and thousands of people are dying of starvation and malnutrition, the Vietnamese have turned their attention to Cambodia because he was suspicious of all of his military along the border. Pol Pot decided it was time to do a cleansing of his military forces along the Vietnamese border because he did not trust them. He thought they were all traitors. So 100,000 military men, their wives and their children, and other political officials were executed in this purge. 100,000 people executed in one purge. And since this was actually most of his defensive line along the Cambodian border with Vietnam, it opened up Cambodia wide for Vietnam to invade. So in 1978, Vietnam invaded Cambodia, and it only took 13 days to take the capital. That is it, 13 days. And Pol Pot actually was able to flee into the jungle and escape. But his reign of terror finally ended with the invasion of Vietnam, or from Vietnam. And it was only 3.5 years. He had only reigned for 3.5 years, and 2 million people died because of his reign of terror. That is just mind-boggling to me. It took him 3 years to do that. And no one talks about this man. No one. It is mind-boggling to me. So, this wasn't actually the end of Pol Pot's influence and party, because ironically, with the help of the Thai government, Chinese government, and even a little bit of the United States, Pol Pot was able to rebuild his forces and fight back from the northern part of the country. Because for some reason, one communist party was better than another communist party, I guess, for the United States, but China was helping Pol Pot quite a bit. But after fighting and being involved for so long, and I'm sure you're thinking the same thing I was thinking when I was doing my research, isn't he like super old at this point? Because he was born in the 20s. Like, we're in 1985 now, and he actually announced that he was retiring from leadership from the party. But this didn't stop his involvement. He still had a lot of influence and a lot of power. And the Vietnamese were able to actually clench down on the Khmer Rouge and slowly weeded them out of the north. But again, Pol Pot was able to escape. And in 1988, he actually went to China to get help with a cancer diagnosis because he had been diagnosed with cancer. And it was quiet for a little bit, but in 1996, most Khmer Rouge followers had actually been convinced to no longer support the party. They realized what it was and what had happened because of the party. And so a lot of them turned their backs on the party. So it was slowly diminishing and slowly dissolving. But Pol Pot had actually suffered from a stroke and was paralyzed down the left side of his body. But that did not stop him from sending out execution orders. He still had enough influence at this point in time to send out execution orders. There were two of his former leaders that had turned on the Khmer Rouge and were working with the current government. And Pol Pot sent out execution orders for both of those leaders to be killed. And 11 other family members also were killed around this time. It was never proven that it was Pol Pot that sent out those orders, but it's believed that he was the one who ordered them to be killed because they were turning their backs on his political party, on his movement, on his beliefs. So, in June 19th, 1997, so the following year, he was arrested by the military of Cambodia because they were just sick of dealing with him. They were sick of the Khmer Rouge and all their sneakiness and him killing people and putting out execution orders. Like, they had had enough. They were just done. So he was sentenced to house arrest. And in April 17th, 1998, he actually heard on the radio that the Khmer Rouge had agreed to hand him over to an international tribunal for his crimes against humanity. So he finally was about to face justice for the millions of people that he killed, and he died that night. Yeah, he died. And a lot of people think that it was natural causes. He was really old. He was, sick, had had the stroke. So a lot of people think it was natural causes. But there's also a lot of people that believe that he actually killed himself because he did not want to face the repercussions of his behavior and what he had done to so many people. And before they were able to do a medical examination to determine his cause of death, he was actually cremated. They made sure to cremate his body super fast so no one could see if he had actually killed himself. So Pol Pot never had to face the consequences of what he had done. He killed millions of people. He forced people into labor camps. He killed people because they were socially higher than he wanted them to be. Like, he targeted religions. Like, he was horrible. He tortured people to get them to admit to things that they had never done. even after his reign of terror and after he died, the people of Cambodia were traumatized, to say the least, because he didn't just target, some of the population. Like in Nazi Germany, you still had a ton of Germans that didn't face the evils of the concentration camps. That is not what Pol Pot did. Pol Pot made his entire population suffer. Like, I can't even get the words out because I'm just so incredibly upset that he was able to torture an entire population of an entire country and killed so many people. The fact that the delusions and visions of one individual forced an entire population to conform to his dreams is terrifying. It could traumatize an entire nation. They didn't trust any leaders. I still don't think they trust leaders because of the horrors that they face. Like, there's a monument there currently that you can go to, that you can see all the skulls of, not even all of them, just a ton of them just stacked together so you can see the horrors that Pol Pot inflicted upon his own people. I find it so interesting how little people actually know about Pol Pot's story. I think that more people need to know about this because it was an atrocious act in humanity's history. And so few people know about it. So I think it's important to talk about these things, even though they're horrible and awful, and the way he killed people. Man, this man. But I think it's important to talk about, because if we don't remember our past, people like this one visionary, quote unquote visionary man who had an idea of the perfect society and what it could look like, could happen again. Like, everyone has that saying, you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it or whatever. It's true, though. It's true. So I think it's important that we talk about this thing. And for his role in this mass murder of millions of people and the torture and trauma that he inflicted on an entire country, Pol Pot is our horrible human in history for the week. So I hope you enjoyed his story. He, like I said, this man, he makes me angry. The fact that he never faced justice for what he did, it just makes me angry. Just like it does on every time one of these people never faces justice. It makes me angry. But join us next week as we talk about someone who I have gotten a lot of requests from listeners for this specific individual. Now, this person, let's see if you can guess before I finish telling you who it is, but this individual sent terror through all of London and then seemed to disappear off of the face of the earth. He was a man of mystery, but was even more horrifying because of the mystery surrounding him. No one knew who he was or where he went or where he came from. He brutally killed 5 women and left their mutilated bodies for other people to find. So join us next week as we talk about the infamous Jack the Ripper. I know you guys have been waiting for it. It's gonna be epic. So join us next week here on HHH Podcast, where we talk about those horrible humans in history. We'll talk to you guys next week.